As someone who has very proactively been doing self-actualization work for about 7+ years now, reading hundreds of books, going to meditation retreats, doing daily meditation every day, cleaning up my diet, daily exercise, etc., I can very confidently say that most people do not really understand what self-actualization is, and even beyond that, what self-transcendence is. So that's why I'm going to be making this video. I want to just give you some details on what is this kind of stuff. So let's just jump right into it. Self-actualization and self-transcendence are human needs. And when you do not get a need met, you get sick. Just like when you don't get the calcium that you need, right? You get sick. When you don't get the vitamin B or vitamin A that you need, you get sick. Same thing here. When you don't get these higher needs met, there's disease for the most part that begins to get created in your soul, in your mind, in your nervous system, in your body, in your emotional life, in your relationships, in your career, etc. And self-actualization, right, the typical way of saying it is reaching your full potential, right? And that's kind of vague for the most part. There's a lot of ways of interpreting that. But self-actualization actually means very specific things, right? And you can actually look into the work of Abraham Maslow, the guy who actually coined the term self-actualization. He has a lot of great work on this, like Toward a Psychology of Being, that book, right? There's a whole bunch of them that I've read that are absolutely fantastic. And I can say that self-actualization is reaching your full potential, but what that really is not something that a lot of people are kind of like conventionally used to for the most part. You might think that reaching your full potential is making that kick-ass business, or like getting like the most beautiful girlfriend or the funniest provider husband, and like kind of maximizing your results in the external world. And although all that stuff is perfectly fine, right? Maybe getting the biggest muscles that you can get, right? All that stuff is totally fine. But the biggest thing with self-actualization is this ability to actually turn inward, not to the exclusion of the external world, but this kind of radical turning inward where you're actually breaking down various forms of conditioning in your own mind, in your own being as a whole, really, that are actually keeping you stuck. Of course, things like limiting beliefs, right? We've all heard it before, limiting beliefs and fear and all this kind of stuff. But essentially, you're breaking forms of conditioning that are actually distorting your perception of reality. They're distorting your perception of self, of others, of existence, etc. And as you break down these perceptions, as you break down this conditioning, you actually start to feel more free. As you break away from the limited notions of self, the confines of the ego, of the separate self, your authenticity comes back. Your sense of spontaneity, of freedom, of creativity, of intrinsic motivation, of purpose, of joy, it just starts to really come back. Kind of like when you were a kid, but now it's integrated with all the things you learned as an adult, like conceptualizing and labeling and having a mind and all this kind of stuff. So self-actualization is a very integral thing, meaning it's very integrated. So it's like you're integrating the internal world, but you're integrating it also with the external world, not dividing and separating the two, but learning to navigate both, being competent in both. It's bringing back that inner child, but not abandoning the mature adult that you are, and also tapping into the wise old human being, right? That kind of particular archetype that exists inside you simultaneously. So self-actualization is what we call a being need, as opposed to a survival need. So what does this mean, right? Just for clarity. A survival need, basically, it's something that I personally lack, I'm deficient in, and I need to go out and get it in order to like be okay. Like food or water or clean air or connection or sex or money, things like this. It's like, I lack this and I need more, right? But the thing is once you are stable enough, right? The second you have enough clean water and clothes on your back and a good shelter and all this kind of stuff, the answer to why do I suffer, or why am I not fulfilled, or all this kind of stuff, or right, how do I be the best version of myself? How do I be the healthiest version of myself? The answer to all this stuff isn't more like just getting and maximizing for my ego and myself, but it's about transcending and moving beyond the self and the ego. It's actually about looking into the mind and all its kind of delusions and programmings and conditionings, and kind of deconstructing that. So that's where being needs come in. This is post-survival, right? If you're watching this video, what does that really mean? That means that you have energy that you don't have to actually put towards your survival. So now you can give it to this video. You can give it to something beyond survival, ideally self-actualization, And this is actually a very big deal, right? Because a lot of people on the planet don't really have the energy to give to something other than their survival. They look for water for a long period of time, or they are working at their job all the time. They struggle to pay the bills, etc., right? And this is very serious stuff. So if you're watching this video, you don't really want to take your position for granted. You're in a very rare position that very few human beings have ever even been in like the history of all of humanity, right? If you're watching this, you can dedicate your energy to self-actualization, to self-transcendence. And again, what does this kind of look like, right? Let's kind of dig into this a little bit deeper, right? What are these being needs that I talk about? So being needs do not repress survival needs. It's very integral, like I said. You're integrating these higher needs with the lower needs. So how do we integrate self-actualization into our careers, into our economy, into our health and well-being, into our hospitals, into our education system, etc.? How do we integrate being needs into every domain of our life? It's like we're fusing the higher consciousness with our base level needs. The higher and the lower they're not separate, right? It's very integrated, right? There's a natural wholeness that is actually occurring that we have to pick up on. So let's talk about like practices for like how do you actually self-actualize, right? A lot of people in our sort of like hustle, grind set culture, they might think like I need to go out and I need to like work my ass off and I need to kick a lot of ass, right? No, although like partially, right? So let me explain this. Self-actualization is not endless grinding. Self-actualized people can work, and they can work quite hard, and they can be like very focused and like determined, etc., and usually a lot more disciplined and like internally integrated and whole than a non-self-actualized person. But the self-actualized person does not work to the point of emotional disassociation and disconnection from one's being, disconnection from one's soul, disconnection from themselves as a presence. The self-actualized person doesn't just get stuck in these kind of rigid mental patterns. They're very aware of these kinds of rigidities inside of their mind, their ego, their being, their nervous system, etc. And they know how to not fall into them, although, right, everyone has struggles to some degree. But for the most part, the self-actualized person is very non-ideological. They're very flexible. They pick up multiple perspectives. They read Hinduism, Buddhism, different branches of that, Christianity, Islam, different political philosophies, social democracy, capitalism. Like they've looked into all this stuff and they're integrating like the best of all this stuff so that their mind is just like this blossoming, beautiful flower. Like their being is just like blossoming. They've picked up so much profound wisdom from so many different places that they themselves are just like, they fucking love life. A self-actualized person like sees the beauty in the mundane. They don't take the mundane for granted as much, right? The self-actualized and especially the self-transcendent person, the duality between the mundane and the divine, or the ordinary and the extraordinary, this collapses, right? Like for me personally, like when I look at my hand, it's rocks on the floor, like I can tap into the very magic and the essence of creation itself because I'm conscious of it. It's my actual direct experience after doing so many years of self-inquiry and meditation and all this kinds of stuff, right? So how do you actually self-actualize? What are some good practices to actually do? Meditation, right? This is very foundational because self-actualization is about breaking free of things that you are unconscious of. Self-actualization is about breaking free of mental structures, psychological structures, various structures of, various kinds in the nervous system and your emotional life, etc. They're actually limiting you and keeping you confined. Self-transcendence is about breaking out of the separateness of the ego, that delusion, and identifying as the pure presence, the pure empty presence that you actually are. So meditation is extremely important because instead of being identified with the things that are actually keeping you stuck where you're at, you kind of be the witness of them, shining some light on those things, dissolving that conditioning, right? And then being able to consciously create something else. So meditation is very profound. You learn how to process your emotions, how to feel deeply, how to be aware of your thoughts, how to detach from the ego, how to investigate into your actual experience. Whew. Reading books is really important, right? Figuring out maybe the point of existence. Reading books is actually extremely important, especially books that are at that self-actualization and self-transcendence level of consciousness. So conscious business, right? Go on my book list, like literally like 150 books of just pure genius and self-actualization and high consciousness in various aspects of life. Relationships, spirituality, psychology, therapy and healing, health and well-being, business and career and teaching and politics and all this kinds of stuff. Essentially, when you're reading books, it's not like, right, a lot of people get this kind of stuff wrong. They think that it's about memorizing the whole book. It's really just about interacting with the book and getting the energy and allowing just simply you reading the book and being that person who reads books. It's about allowing that to transform you, right? So self-actualized people, they've typically studied a lot of perspectives, very flexible, non-ideological, big thing. So when you see like a very religious person or like a very dogmatic, even atheist or scientific type, just very dogmatic, very closed energy, this is a sign of a lack of self-actualization. That inflexible aspect of them is actually sickness for the most part. It actually is not a healthy thing. Not only that, but when you're right, you can look at very dogmatic people, like very like politically extreme people as well. You can feel it in their energy that they're just very closed. It's a detectable thing that you can sense that their mind is very rigidly attached to this perspective. I think the very stereotypical like Christian, right, the sort of fundamentalist Christian, just a prime example of this. It's so obvious to sense that their mind is very rigid and closed and absolutely stuck in a particular point of view. The self-actualized person is not like that. The self-actualized person is not stuck in any particular ideology, whether it's scientism, rationalism, atheism, Christianity, Buddhism, capitalism, whatever it is. The self-actualized person, they've freed their mind from dogma and ideology for the most part. They're significantly less reactive and non-ideological than, let's say, the non-self-actualized person, because the identification with various ideologies is, number one, something that they're actually seeing through. They realize that this isn't actually who they are. This identity is actually constructed, number one. And number two, there's a reactivity that comes when you're very identified with an ideology. Now you got to defend it and fight for it and all this kind of stuff. They don't do that. The self-actualized person, you can think of like in Taoism or in Buddhism, there's that sense of flow with life and greater unity. The self-actualized person is displaying these kinds of things. The self-transcended person has really realized these kinds of things and just embodies them in the way that they cook in the morning, in the way that they wipe their butt on the toilet, etc. The self-transcended person has really like seen this stuff deeply, and it's just their lived experience nonstop. So self-actualization, right? This is kind of a brief introductory to this kind of stuff. I really recommend picking up like Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow and looking into his stuff on self-transcendence as well. And looking into like the psychology of this. I recommend going on my book list. But self-actualization isn't just about making the most kick-ass business or whatever it is, or just having the most beautiful girlfriend or the biggest muscles or the most status or the most power. Self-actualization is actually post-survival. So these survival needs, there's a sense of detachment from them. There's a sense of like, you know, that's cool and I can interact with these kinds of things and I need to in order to survive. But like, I'm not a slave to these things. I'm not a slave to like, I need endless income, or I'm not like a slave to, I need more and more sex and more connection. The self-actualized and self-transcended person has more detachment from their needs because for the most part, they're gratified. They can actually just like step back from them a little bit and actually care about truth. Whereas the ordinary conventional mind is too focused on survival, which is now distorting reality, so they can't really care about truth. Even though if they say, yeah, I care about truth, it's actually this kind of deception going on in their mind. So the self-actualized person is actually the person who can care about truth. How many people are self-actualized on the planet? At the time of Abraham Maslow, he said about 1% reach self-actualization. Now, at this point in time, it's probably around 5 to 7. How many people are self-transcended? Maybe 1%, probably less than 1% of people. So I want you to appreciate this one thing. These are advanced levels of consciousness and psychological development that most people are absolutely unfamiliar with. Most people never even meet people who are like this. And it can seem like a dream. It can seem like a bunch of bullshit to someone who's very stuck in survival and has a lot of traumas and wounds and closures and things like this. But it's very real, right? Look at spiral dynamics, ego development theory, right? All this stuff is just like the development of consciousness in human beings. Of course, the hierarchy of needs, but models like spiral dynamics, ego development theory, right? These show the levels of consciousness a lot better, actually. So self-actualization isn't just about like maximizing, the things I need for survival for myself, but it's actually being able to gratify your needs in a healthy, conscious way, like a conscious business, a conscious relationship, all this kinds of stuff. But also going beyond survival entirely, moving into being, truth, presence, pure consciousness, deconstructing your ego, deconstructing conditioning that you have, seeing the world through a multiplicity of lens, right? You want to put on the Islam lens, and then the Hindu lens, and then the right-wing lens, and then the left-wing lens, and it's I apologize for that. I had to make some space on my camera. So the self-actualized mind is very flexible. It's putting on all these different perspectives, and it can filter the world through every one of these perspectives and then just kind of let them go, almost like you're just putting on some glasses, right? Put on this pair, right? Put on that pair. And it's quite easy, actually. And this especially becomes true for self-transcended people at that self-transcendence level of consciousness. They very deeply realize that all constructs and narratives, all ideologies and all narratives, stories, ideas, thoughts, labels, are all constructs of the mind and do not represent reality or the actual nature of our existence very deeply. They're ultimately wrong in the sort of grand scheme of things, in the absolute sense. They don't represent the true nature of reality. They can be relatively true, but they don't really represent what reality fundamentally is. They are not our fundamental identity, so why make such a big fuss over them? Why be so reactive? Why be so emotionally attached if we're going to have to let go of all this stuff at one point? I can use it, but then I can let go of it, just like a tool. I can use the hammer, and then I'm done. I let go of it. All right, so that's it. That's it for this video. If you guys enjoyed, remember to leave a thumbs up, subscribe, leave a comment. I'm doing one-to-one coaching, so if you really love to raise your consciousness, self-actualize, self-transcend, heal your mind, be a conscious creator, etc., consider looking into getting some coaching from me. Odds are we would be a good fit if you're very, very interested in this kind of stuff. My discovery call is completely free. You can check it out. Link is in the pinned comment. Take it easy.